Video games have come a long way. What started as an almost insignificant niche for basement-dwelling nerds has turned into a multi-billion-dollar business and pop cultural phenomenon that entertains people all around the globe. In just a little over 30 years, the 8-bit pixel art of NES classics like Final Fantasy, The Legend of Zelda or Metroid turned into the jaw-dropping graphical splendor we've come to expect from current AAA titles. Many things have changed. I'm sure everyone who has been there from the start or grew up with video games will agree. Despite all the rapid advancements and changing perception of video games, a few people are simply unwilling to accept these changes. This is why one debate has remained virtually unchanged throughout the decades: the never-ending debate about violence in video games. It is undeniable that violence was and still is an integral part of countless games. But what once looked like an undefinable mess of red pixels in the original Doom can appear awfully authentic and shocking in modern titles like The Last of Us or Call of Duty World War II. While the reduced pixel graphics of old-school titles can mostly be laughed off as unconvincing and comical gore fantasies, the fact that games have reached a level of graphical fidelity that can rival CGI standards from a couple of years ago has put video games back into the spotlight of mass media. Because video games are still such a young medium and bear the stigma of undemanding entertainment for kids and teenagers, they've proven to be perfect cannon fodder for the agendas of mainstream media outlets. Violent games continue to be used as a convenient scapegoat whenever clearly mentally disturbed people do horrible things.
If you're murdering somebody in cyberspace, in a sense you're performing the act, you like it or not.
By the way, speaking of evil, do you hear Grand Theft Auto 5 made almost $1 billion in the first 24 hours? Don't let your kids watch that, play that. Don't. It's not just a video game.
A young man shoots his mother in cold blood after getting mad at a video game. I'm sure he had no severe mental issues. Let's blame the game. A Call of Duty swatting incident results in the death of a 28-year-old father. Let's not blame the two immature shitheads who are oblivious to the fact that sending a heavily armed SWAT team in on someone can have tragic real-world ramifications. It's clearly Call of Duty's fault. Trump gets elected as the President of the United States. I'm actually surprised mainstream media hasn't found a way to blame that on video games as well. You get my point. There are plenty of people out there who are purposefully misinforming the public in order to hurt the video game industry. But I don't want to talk about the effects video games do or do not exert on real-life behavior. This topic has been discussed to death and the jury on that is still out. Today, I would like to ask the question why so many people blame video games for real-life crimes and why they are outright denying that games are mature enough to deal with difficult topics in general. Back in October of last year, Sony held its Paris Games Week conference and sparked quite a controversy due to the extreme violence that was featured in the newest The Last of Us Part 2 footage and Quantic Dream's Detroit Become Human. While I agree with the complaint that Sony should have given a disclaimer for the heavy content that was about to follow, I don't think mature topics such as child abuse and torture are off limits just because we are dealing with video games. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a discussion about the representation of violence in games, quite the opposite. But in order to have a discussion in the first place, games need to be allowed to tackle mature issues. Which leads me to one of the most misinformed and enraging articles I've ever read. The UK's Mail on Sunday published an article which addresses the content showcased in the Paris Games Week trailer for Quantic Dream's upcoming Android drama Detroit Become Human. This article and the statements of the people featured in it are the reason for this video. It showcases a fundamental problem when it comes to the perception of video games. I'm sure for many of you the controversial opinions uttered in this article by British politicians and members of the NSPCC are probably old news. I heard about the general debate surrounding Sony's showcase and that quite a few people criticized the graphic violence displayed, but I had no idea about this article. As you all know, Quantic Dream is under the creative lead of David Cage and known for games like Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls. Comparable to Heavy Rain, the survival of the three major characters in Detroit Become Human depends on the decisions of the player. The entire game revolves around difficult choices. The story is full of branching paths, sometimes with over a dozen different outcomes for an individual scene. Let's have a look at what Childline founder Dame Esther Ranson has to say about the latest Detroit trailer. Violence against children is not entertainment, it's not a game. It's a real nightmare for thousands of children who have to live through these kinds of scenarios. The makers of this game should be thoroughly ashamed. I think it's perverse. Who thinks beating a child is entertainment? She goes on to say, "There was a time, more cruel and less civilized than ours, when public executions were enjoyed as entertainment. In those savage days, crowds watched old women being drowned as witches and animals tortured for fun. But I've never heard of little girls being beaten with a belt as part of a game. That, in my view, is not just savage, it's seriously damaging. Who would play such a game for fun? People who are impervious to the suffering of children." Yes, you heard right. She just labeled a scene in a video game as a worse crime than gladiator fights in ancient Rome and witch hunt during the Dark Ages.
If she weighs the same as a duck, she's made of wood.
And therefore,
A witch!
I hope I don't have to explain why that's a poor and slightly overblown comparison. But actually, it's the last part that blows my mind. Who would play such a game? People who are impervious to the suffering of children. The offensiveness of this comment is absolutely baffling and clearly reveals a severe lack of knowledge regarding video game culture as a whole. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad that Esther Ranson is standing up for children who are victims of domestic violence, but that doesn't change the fact that she is shamelessly attacking a medium she knows nothing about. There are probably over 1 billion gamers on this planet who condemn child abuse and don't think beating a child is entertainment. So to insinuate that people like me, people who value video games as an art form and are looking forward to Detroit Become Human, are supporting and to a certain degree acting out the disgusting fantasies of child abusers is a bold fucking statement to make. What an ignorant accusation. When we take a look at the comment of the chairman of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, Damian Collins, it becomes blatantly obvious why people like him and Esther Ranson are so up in arms against a video game that tries to deal with difficult themes like child abuse. It is completely wrong for domestic violence to be part of a video game, regardless of what the motivation is. Domestic violence is not a game, and this simply trivializes it. The accusations of people like Damian Collins and Esther Ranson are insanely problematic and short-sighted for two reasons. For one thing, I'm sick of being lectured on video game culture by unprogressive dinosaurs whose last gaming experience was Pong. I'm sick of self-proclaimed experts who know little to nothing about the medium they are so desperately trying to destroy. I wouldn't be surprised if Ranson and Collins haven't played one video game in their entire lives. So that's the first and obvious problem. In regards to video games, they've no fucking idea what they are talking about. Even more important and even more troubling is the ignorant claim that difficult topics like child abuse are off limits just because we are dealing with a video game. Collins is convinced video games are not capable of exploring divisive and mature themes. Why, you might ask? Well, let me give you the short and quick answer. Because he's still living in the past. He doesn't regard video games as art. Movies and literature are allowed to deal with rape, child abuse and all thoughts of violence because there seems to be a mutual agreement between young and old generations that movies and novels can be more than lowbrow entertainment. Video games cannot raise thought-provoking questions or craft deep narratives according to some people. This way of thinking is something I take issue with because degrading video games to mindless entertainment for little kids interferes with the evolution of the entire medium. Clearly, video games have evolved into far more than a simple pastime for kids in the 80s.
Did you see the latest Nintendo newsletter?
Whoa, nice graphics. I'd like to get my hands on that game.
You mean you haven't played it yet? We can play it on my Nintendo Entertainment System. It's The Legend of Zelda, and it's really rad. Those creatures from Ganon are pretty bad. Octoroks, Tektites, Levers too. But with your help, our hero pulls through. Yeah, go Link, yeah, get Zelda.
Video game shows are getting bigger and bigger. The financial success of certain games is starting to outpace the biggest Hollywood blockbusters. And there's no such thing as the stereotypical gamer anymore. Gaming has reached women, men, children and adults, and more generations learn to grow up and love video games. Games like The Last of Us and especially the upcoming reimagination of God of War are proving that both the people who play video games and the people who make them are striving for titles that have grown up just as they did. Video games aren't just made for kids anymore, they are made for everyone. To deny video games the status of an art form and outright forbid millions of people around the globe who grew up with video games and learned to value them as an incredible form of self-expression and artistic energy to strive for a video game medium that grows alongside them is premature and ignorant. Literature now exists for over 2000 years and movies have accompanied us for over a century. Video games, on the other hand, have been around for a mere 40 years. That is to say, they are an incredibly young medium which still has a lot to learn from its century and millennia old counterparts. But one thing is for certain, video games are here to stay. So instead of forbidding video games to deal with complex and morally ambiguous topics like child abuse, why don't we give them the same chance to evolve and improve as an art form as movies and literature? The sooner games start to implement divisive and difficult subjects in their stories, the better. This way they will stumble and fall a couple of times, but given enough time, they will rise up as a stronger and wiser medium, equipped to add emotional and powerful comments on human nature, social issues and our collective dreams and fears. What the people in this article are proposing, to put it plain and simple, is short-sighted and ridiculous. And who knows, each individual scene of Detroit will feature a couple of dozen different outcomes. So maybe there's an option in which you don't fight the abuser, pick up Alice and inform the authorities. My point is, it's of little use to call out a game for promoting and empowering the violent actions of disturbed individuals before the actual release. The game isn't even fucking out yet. Talking about jumping the gun. But some people aren't actually interested in the finished game, because they clearly already made up their mind. But hey, here's the positive side to all of this. Millions of gamers already treat video games as art, and judging by the immense growth of the video game industry, more will join our cause every day.